Truly, you have made a monkey out of me. Hi friends, I'm Joe, this is Same Name Different Game, and this episode, at Extra Life donor request, we are looking at Toki. Now you may very well be saying, what's Toki? And honestly, that's not a completely unreasonable reaction. So let me start explaining as we dive in with a little history. Toki is one of a handful of games developed by TAD Corporation, so named for its founder, Tadashi Yokoyama. Yokoyama was previously the general manager of North American sales at Data East and left to start his own company with a handful of other Data East expatriates. Sadly, they only lasted about 4 years, from 1988 until December of 1992. If this story sounds familiar, it's because there were a lot of small Japanese developer publishers like this in the late 80s and early 90s, splintered off from larger operations, either when those operations came to an end, or when the people forming the new venture got fed up. Some managed to be successful, remaining operational for years, like Treasure, made up of former Konami employees, or Cave, part of the diaspora that resulted from Toa Plan's bankruptcy. Many more, like TAD, came and went. If you know TAD, it's likely because of either Toki or perhaps Cabal, one of the first gallery shooter games, coming years before Wild Guns or Sin and Punishment. They made 3 other games, a middling beat-em-up called Legionnaire, Heated Barrel, clearly meant as an Old West-themed follow-up to their previous employer's Heavy Barrel, and Blood Brothers, an Old West-themed follow-up to Cabal. So what's with all the Old West theming, I can hear you asking? Well, according to Portuguese gaming magazine Old Gamer, TAD specifically targeted the Western market for their games. And in hindsight, that actually makes a couple things in Toki make more sense. So let's do this. Let's get into it with the arcade original.
Toki was released in 1989, distributed in North America, as all of TAD's games were, by Fabtech, a short-lived arcade distributor located in Washington State. Toki tells the story of Tarzan-esque warrior Toki, whose lady love Miho is kidnapped by the monster Bashtar, servant of the evil wizard Vuki Medlo. To add insult to injury, Vuki Medlo has turned Toki into an ape. But fortunately, as an ape, Toki has the power to spit fire. And I don't mean he's a super good rapper, I mean literally spit fire out of his mouth. It's not entirely clear if this is an unexpected side effect of the spell, or he could always do that, but in any case, Toki is off to traverse the land to save Miho and get himself turned back to a human. Which, I mean, humans are technically still apes, but whatever.
This game wears its inspirations on its sleeve, not only giving us a Ghosts and Goblins-esque map, but taking a page from that game's difficulty as well. Of course, the gallant knight Arthur wears armor, so he can take 2 hits, but I'm sorry to report that Toki is, well, even more fragile, and dies in just one hit. He's also got a giant hitbox, so be ready for that. This game was squarely located in the time frame that saw arcade games using bigger sprites, even if it wasn't practical from a gameplay perspective, because they wanted to look more impressive than home games. Sadly, less attention was paid to the music. 5 of 6 stages use the exact same song, and by the end, it's super grating. To help on his journey, Toki will find power-ups, including 5 different types of shots, from the high-damage, low-range fire, to the Contra-inspired spread shot, to a double shot, a big shot, and a very powerful but relatively rare charge shot. He can also find an American football helmet to make him kinda sorta invincible. Certain stage hazards and enemies can still kill you, but it's not entirely clear which ones. As you can imagine, that's a bit frustrating. Finally, there are sneakers, guaranteed to make you run faster and jump higher. Despite these tools, Toki remains very much a quarter muncher. In some ways, it feels like this is mitigated by numerous checkpoints, but the game pulls one of the classic BS moves on you in the final stage, when you are suddenly limited to just 5 more continues. This is really infuriating. They've already taken your lunch money in the first 5 stages, and now they won't even let you credit feed just to see the ending. And there isn't even a dip switch for the operator to change this. Furthermore, Miho guilt trips you on the continue screen, which I honestly kind of love. Oddly enough, the bosses are mostly pretty easy. You'll use a life or 2 on each of them to learn the patterns, but once you know them, all 6 are more or less pushovers. Ultimately, Toki isn't a bad game, it's just not a great one either. It's very middling. Doesn't do anything spectacular, doesn't do anything horrible. Except that nonsense with the last stage. But be that as it may, a game did not need to be a massive blockbuster hit in those days to get ported. And ported this one got. Of course, to a handful of microcomputer formats, but as I so often do here, I'm gonna slide on past those and go to the console versions, starting with the NES. Toki for the NES was, near as I can tell, ported and published by Taito in both Japan and North America in 1991. On the surface, it's a surprisingly faithful port with almost identical stage layouts, power-ups, and that song! However, the considerably weaker NES isn't able to put nearly as many enemies or projectiles on screen at once, so it becomes way easier. Add to that, the North American version gives the player a life bar, starting with 2 hits, and can be raised to 4. I was able to do a 1 credit clear of this game the first time I ever played it. It limits your continues from the beginning, but that doesn't really matter since you won't need them. And while it's not as expensive as many late-era NES games from Taito, like Flintstone's Surprise at Dinosaur Peak, Power Blade 2, or Little Samson, it's still well over $50 for a bare cart these days, and that just feels unreasonable for a 30-minute experience. Well, maybe the Atari Lynx fares better. I don't want to spend too much time on this one since I had to play it on emulator. The sound is definitely worse than real hardware, but for all I can tell, it might play worse too, so take this with a grain of salt. That said, my experience was rough. Ported by an in-house team at Atari in 1992, it certainly looks the part, with the assets being more in line with the arcade than the NES game, but just the same, the controls feel bad. The hitboxes feel bigger, and again, running under emulation, the grating music is even more grating. Hard pass on this one for me, unless you're a die-hard Lynx fan. And that brings us to our final port of the time, on the Genesis. And it's not really a port. Truly falling into the theme of this show, the Genesis version of Toki, subtitled Going Ape Spit in North America, but still just called Juju Densetsu in Japan, like all the other versions. This one was developed by Santos to be published by Sega themselves, who would in fact acquire Santos at the end of 1991, the year this game came out. Believe it or not, this is the same development team that did Shinobi 3. But you sure wouldn't know it to play this game. Here, the game is expanded to 9 stages, and while it retains a lot of the look and many of the bosses of the arcade original, a new power-up is added, a bouncing shot, the football helmet is replaced with an invincibility star ripped right from Super Mario Bros., and the stage layouts are entirely different. Unfortunately, many of them are meandering, too wide open for this style of game, and Toki moves like he's walking in molasses. Those two factors together make this game an absolute chore to play. Oh, and that song is still used in nearly every single stage. Finally, while all versions have a snow stage, this is the only one that actually adds that thing that all game players love: ice physics. For a moment, you almost enjoy it, because Toki actually moves quickly when he's sliding. But then you realize even floating platforms have it, and staying on them, or God forbid, trying to shoot on an angle while standing on them, is a huge pain now. If it weren't for the Lynx, this would definitely be the worst version of Toki. Trust me, the NES rearrangement of Bionic Commando, this is not. And that brings us to our final version for this episode. A version that still baffles me, to be honest. A version that, by all rights, feels like it shouldn't really exist, at least not as a commercial product you can buy. But this is the 2018 remake, played here on the Nintendo Switch. I am so confused by the existence of this game. Toki, developed by the now defunct French studio Golgoth, was announced over a decade ago in 2009, slated for Xbox Live Arcade on the 360, and according to an interview from that time with studio founder Anthony Di Ferreira, it sounds like it had been approved. I don't know why it wasn't released then, but he says in this interview that they decided to make it basically because they could afford the license, and it's a small enough game for their very tiny studio. Fair play, I suppose, but I have to be honest. This is a better remake than this game deserves. The only other game I can think of that got this kind of treatment is Wonder Boy in the Dragon's Trap, which, at least to me, feels like much more of a cult classic than Toki. But still, just look at this. The art by illustrator and animator Philippe Desolé is legitimately fantastic. The game has a new orchestrated soundtrack with more than 2 level themes. I mean, I just don't get why this game got such a lavish treatment, and there are legit stone-cold classics out there that can't even seem to get a basic re-release. This is bizarre. And what's perhaps more bizarre is that it didn't come out until 2018. And even then, not just not on the 360 as originally intended, clearly, but not even on Xbox One. This game initially launched on the Switch, courtesy of French publisher Microids, who must have put the finishing touches on it and sent it out. It is now on Xbox One and, well, playable on just about everything current, I suppose. From a gameplay perspective, it's still Toki. It feels exactly like the arcade game, it's just in widescreen now. In fact, it's so close I'm kind of surprised it lacks the option Dragon's Trap had to change the visuals back to the original style. Still, in that respect, it's a success for folks who love the arcade game and want it with a modern touch. The only real change I noticed here is that you can have the football helmet and the sneakers at the same time, where the original arcade only allows one or the other. There is one problem. Well, two related problems, I guess. The first part is that you get 9 continues from the beginning and that's it, with no option to change it and no Gradius 5 style mechanic to earn more by playing the game. The thing that compounds that is that unlike in other versions, when you use one of those continues, you go back to the beginning of the stage you're on, rather than the last checkpoint you hit. Clearly, this was meant to combat the issue of the NES game's extremely short completion time. People probably don't want to pay $15 for a game they can credit feed through in 40 minutes. But then at least give me the chance to earn the right to credit feed through it. Time Crisis 2 on PS2 has a mechanic similar to Gradius 5, where you start with very few credits, but you earn one more each time you play the game until you run out. I'd rather Toki started me with 2 credits and a chance to eventually get unlimited than just stick me at 9. And the price is certainly something of a factor even with the 9 credits. I'm generally not into the more game means more value argument, but $15 for a 6-stage arcade game feels more than a bit steep, to me. I mean, if you love the original game, you'll love this. Yeah, I'm still confused about the audience for this game, but let's put that aside and do like we always do and take a look and a listen side by side. That song. Anyways, visually and orally, it's not a contest. The remake is ridiculous, honestly. And now I just really want Capcom to do this to Ghouls and Ghosts. But as far as versions of the time go, The arcade is clearly the winner there. Arcade hardware of that era was so far ahead of consoles, it wasn't even a contest. But in their way, they all look fine. Even the NES game doesn't look bad by the standards of the system. And that makes it time to give The Edge. And it's a little bit pricey for what it is, but it is absolutely the modern version, available on PC, PS4, Xbox One, and Switch. I cannot imagine wanting to play any of the other versions, really, but the arcade original is still fairly good, and the NES version is easy, but it's fine. Those are the good ones. Then in the basement is the Lynx and Genesis. Now, again, I had to play the Lynx version on an emulator because I don't own an Atari Lynx, and it could play better on real hardware, so I'm reserving some level of judgment there. The Genesis version, for me, was a slog. I did not like that version, so that's my assessment, and that does it. But make sure to come back next time, because I will be bringing you some holiday-tinged nostalgia. I'll see you then. Hey folks, it's Joe, and I just want to thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, do all the normal stuff that everybody on this site asks you to do. Subscribe if you haven't, ring that stupid bell, which I hate. Comment below telling me which classic arcade game you'd like to see get a gorgeous hand-drawn remake. And if you really liked what you saw, consider supporting directly either on Patreon or via YouTube membership. Just $1 per video gets you early access, your name here with these cool people, and more, including the ability to vote in polls to help determine upcoming episodes, which actually just happened for December's episodes. So check that stuff out. Also, there are merch links in the description, as well as affiliate links to small businesses that help the channel. If you're going to buy some stuff from one of those places anyways, maybe use the link, give me a little bit of a kickback. If you want more classic arcade action, my video on Ms. Pac-Man is on the left, and if you want more ports like the Genesis version of Toki that drastically change things up, my video on Bionic Commando is on the right.